In this video, we're working on the fact that you have the knowledge to define a class, which is creating a template to follow, and that you have maybe used or created an object using the new keyword. We are specifically going to focus on constructors. We have default constructors when we design classes, and we have non-default constructors. They allow us to create the objects. When you create an object such as a shape on this example down here, when you use this shape parentheses, you are calling on a method. Remember, using parentheses kind of indicates that you are using or calling a method. That's the default constructor because it has no parameters. So it's a special method in our template. And let's see how we can do this in code. In this example, we have created we are working with a shape class, and we have the setters, we have the getters, and we have some additional methods that we created. Now we're going to go ahead and insert a constructor. And oftentimes a constructor is created when you are defining the class from the beginning, but we wanted to wait to introduce this to you with the idea that you create a template for an object. You can create then a driver program for the object. We have our driver that includes main. And then this idea that this is kind of going to be like a shortcut for creating some of our objects, because in our shape driver, remember that we used all the setter methods in order to set the attributes for a shape. We're going to show you how you can do that using a constructor. So when you create a constructor, it's automatically going to be, we create them public. It's automatically public. I don't know that you actually have to put public. And so public shape, that's our default constructor. It's a default constructor because there's no parameters. Many times we leave it blank because then Java will fill in the default values for the class. And actually Java does that behind the scenes anyway. But then some people will want to go ahead and add some defaults. So if you wanted to have it print something so you knew that, a value was not assigned, then you could give it some default values in this example here. And so if maybe I just say white is my default value or something like that as an example for the color. That is a default constructor. If I go back now and I create my rectangle and I create a new shape, and then I try to print out that shape. So if I borrow these lines of code that printed out my shape before, but now I change triangle to rectangle, just to see what happens. And please notice that I am not using my setter methods. I am going to see what the default values are for my rectangle. And in order for my output to be a little bit neater, I'm going to put in a blank line in there. So if we go ahead and execute this code, it's going to print my triangle with the values I used for the setter, and then it's going to print the values for the rectangle that were in my default constructor. So using the default constructor, whatever values are set inside here are going to be utilized. Another thing that I will mention is some people will use the this operator here. I don't. I usually reserve that. This is my style. I reserve that for the setters using the this.name as assigned name, because that helps me differentiate between the class level variable and the parameter. I don't have that conflict here, so I just use the names of these instance fields directly. And that's also another thing that's kind of nice and sometimes is harder to wrap your head around, is that you have access to these class level variables throughout this whole entire class. So for those of you that have been trying to use maybe some global variables in your program outside of main, so for example, if you've been trying to put variable definitions in between your class and main here, this would be a global area. And so if you've been creating global variables here, we would kind of say, no, don't do that. No, because that makes them not accessible outside of the class. So creating these instance fields is also kind of like having global variables that you can access within this template. So now that we have our default constructor set up, we're going to kind of do the same thing, but then we're going to create a parameterized constructor, which means I need a parameter for each of my instance fields. So a parameterized constructor, I'm going to have string name. I'm going to have double size, and then I'm going to have string color. Now I will use the this operator here to differentiate between my instance fields and my parameters. Size and this dot color is assigned the color parameter. And again, remember that using this keyword is differentiating between the class level variable. So when I use this, it's referring to the class level variable versus the parameter. So if I click on the parameter, you can see the relationship here. So the parameters on the right, the class level variables on the left. So then how do you use this non-default constructor back in your driver program is if I create a third shape, and let's call it trapezoid, all right, and I go new trapezoid, then I can fill in my arguments here. Remember, the arguments are the values that you send in, and the parameters are the placeholders that pick them up in the method. So what's second? I have trapezoid followed by the size, I think, and then followed by the color. I don't remember if that's the correct order. We'll find out because it won't work. And I did new trapezoid. I have a habit of doing that. It's going to be a new shape. Okay. And so I'm creating a new shape. So you have to use the name of the class here and then the name of the object. And since the name of our object is shape, I have to say new shape here. Now this is going to create a trapezoid for me. And so then if I wanted to see if the trapezoid worked, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste this. And we would do a replace. And if you didn't know, you could do, I'm going to try to do rectangle. And I'm going to replace it with trapezoid. This is kind of a nice trick to know, but I have to make sure I only do the ones that I want, which are right here. So I'm going to, where's my replace option? Let's see. Replace, replace, replace. So now when I execute this code, I should see all three of my shapes, and I've got my triangle, I've got my none, which we didn't know it, but that's what I said was my rectangle, and then we got trapezoid. And so we just learned how to create a default constructor, which you could leave blank if you wanted to. You don't have to fill in these values. And we learned how to create a non-default constructor. A couple of things just to kind of remember: there is no return type on the constructors, and the constructor has to be named exactly the same as the class. When I go to use that constructor, I use the new keyword, and if it has parameters, then I can just fill the parameters in directly from my driver.